Just heard We Five with their 1965 hit, You Were On My Mind, and I'm very happy to welcome founding member of We Five, Jerry Burgan, to the program today as we chat a little bit about, well, his book, Wounds to Bind, which is about his career in We Five and also what was happening musically and culturally in the 1960s. Jerry, welcome to the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop, and can you tell us a little bit about that song and the formation of We Five?
Well, it's a complicated question because We Five's formation took years. Technically, the name We Five appeared on the wall at the Hungry Eye in February of 1965. And Mike Stewart and I had already been singing together since 1959. And we'd been singing with a girl since 62, and we'd been singing with Beverly since 64.
Right.
So the concept of We Five had evolved from being a folk group, and that's what was around when I was first started. When it was forming, we lived in Los Angeles, and we used to play hoot nights at the Troubadour in the Ice House and stuff like that, and singing our folk songs. And at San Francisco, when Mike and I were at USF in 63, 64, we met Bob Jones, who was this rock and roller from Hawaii. And he started playing guitar with us and the stuff that we were doing, and we collectively said, you know what, let's move beyond folk music. This is the lyrics are kind of lightweight, and let's find other things to do. So we started looking for other songs, and a lot of people think of We Five as a cover band because we did other people's material. The singer-songwriter thing hadn't really happened yet, except for really Mike's brother John Stewart, who wrote several songs on our first album.
Right.
So anyway, we were doing that when the Kingston Trails manager heard us, and he realized that we were going to get signed by somebody, so he signed us. Brought us to San Francisco to play at the Hungry Eye and just do a test drive of see how we played, on that, and we were there for a week. And he called us We Five. We arrived, in fact, and stood in front of the, I don't know if you know anything about the Hungry Eye, but the marquee was a painted wall. And we said, hey, this is cool, glad to be here. Who's We Five? And he said, you are. And so that's kind of where and how the name came into existence. That was February. In April, they completed work on a recording studio in the basement of the building that Francis Ford Coppola now uses for voiceovers for his film production company. But at the time, the Kingston Trio designed a studio so that they wouldn't have to go to L.A. to record. We Five was the first group to record there. First anybody to record there, really. And that was in April of 65. And at the time, we recorded that song. I believe the only folk, what I would consider even a loosely termed folk rock, would be Walk Right In by the Rooftop Singers.
Right,
it actually had drums on it, and it gave birth to the 12-string craze. But it was still more of a folk sound. And then there were people we were jamming with in Los Angeles. Like I said, the Troubadour, people like the Byrds were playing there. Modern Folk Quartet was playing there. There were people around. And the Byrds, at pretty much the same time that we did, they saw, Hard Day's Night, and they saw that 12-string, and Jim McGuinn is well-established of saying he went out and bought one.
Right.
Because he was a 12-string player. Well, we already had a 12-string, and we're using it in our group, and so our lead guitarist took a DeArmond pickup and stuck it in the sound hole of that guitar, and it's the guitar that was used for You Are On My Mind. Although if you go on YouTube, you'll see him playing a Rickenbacker. It's because once, the record hit and we hit the road, we went ahead and bought instruments appropriate for touring. But a lot of people have asked, how is it that guitar, how'd you get that sound out of a Rickenbacker? And the answer is we didn't use a Rickenbacker. So the Byrds were probably the first group I'm aware of that took folk songs and just played them like a hard rock band.
Right.
And you can call that whatever you want. Dylan obviously did pretty much the same thing, his explosion in Newport, and then the summer of 65, the entire direction of the whole music industry changed. But we recorded You Are On My Mind in April. It was released in San Francisco in June of 1965, and by the end of June, it was the number one song in San Francisco. We used, as I said, an electrified guitar, and we used a drummer to go along with our basic folk format.
Right.
And so the Byrds have this hit. We Five has this hit. As we're playing down we recorded it in San Francisco, but we went back to L.A. and we did Where the Action Is, which was had Paul Revere and the Raiders, who were the Beatles look-alike band that Dick Clark had put together. And we're playing on the beach, and we played at It's Boss, which is now the Comedy Store, and Sonny and Cher, their manager, showed up. So this whole folk rock thing was a group of people, some of whom saw that it was coming, like the Byrds and like us, and others who saw that it was happening and said, okay, I got to get on board.
Right. And
they just changed the direction of what they were doing. And so that's my take on what was going around in the world around me. Our favorite group was a group called the Modern Folk Quartet, and they never made the leap into amplified, though they tried, but their bass player, Chip Douglas, wound up producing the Turtles and the Monkees.
Yeah.
So the people we were moving with that were on the leading edge stayed there. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but
sure.
That's what was going on in 1965 when that record came out.
We're talking to Jerry Burgan of We Five today on the Vintage Rock and Pop Shop. And one of the hallmarks of your band's sound is those harmonies. And I wonder if one person came up with all those arrangements, or everybody just sort of knew their place vocally and it all happened organically.
Actually, the answer to that is yes and yes. Mike Stewart, who passed away in 2002, Michael was really a genius in many levels. His brother John, who was a fantastic songwriter, wrote thousands of songs, marveled at Michael's ability to arrange vocals. And Mike and I started singing as a duet, and then we added a third person, and I'd say by 1961, he was conceptualizing arrangements in his head. We would get together, and I could hear the harmony. I knew what was supposed to be going on, and Mike would say, try this, try this, try this. Well, it was almost like noodling on a piano, but we were fortunate enough to have singers in the group who could literally hear something, try it. We like it, we don't like it, try something else. But Michael would be the driver of the try this approach. But it took people who were able to go through that process with him, because we weren't writing the parts down on pieces of paper. They would get conceptualized.
Right.
When we were seniors in high school, John Stewart was in the Kingston Trio, and he did the soundtrack for a movie about the astronauts. And John wrote the songs. They were all based on historic folk songs or songs that John wrote. Michael, myself, and the first two girls that we sang with went into the studio with John and recorded this track for this movie, and it was about the first 7 astronauts, kind of a, hey, let's get excited about the space program,
right?
Documentary. And John brought a couple of his friends with him who were in a group that had just disbanded called the Journeymen. One of them was John Phillips, one of them was Scott McKenzie. And John Phillips is a magnificent vocal arranger.
Right.
But Michael arranged the vocals for that entire film. And it's hard to say whether that's where Phillips got the idea to do take the core of a folk group and put 2 chicks in it. But
right.
That is exactly what he did with the Mamas and Papas about 8 months later.
A lot of the things we're talking about today are covered in the book, Wounds to Bind, a memoir of the folk rock revolution, and I guess it's essentially, you're just telling the story of what was happening around that time. First of all, how did this project all come together, and what took you so long?
Well, you can probably tell by listening to me already that you ask me a question and I'll just start to talk. And because of the kinds of things that I've done, when I do my shows now, and We Five still plays occasionally, but for the most part, the shows that I do are called Jerry Burgan Songs and Stories.
Right.
And I'll take a song, and I'll talk about the background of where it came from, or, why I like it, or, this became that. And after the shows, people would say, Jerry, you ought to write a book. Jerry, you ought to write. Well, I finally got tired of hearing it, so I started writing stuff down. And when I realized what was coming out of my mind and into the computer, I also realized that I could do it, but if I wanted it to ever get finished and to be done well, that I should work with a writer who that was their thing, was professionally writing. Not to tell me what to write, but to get it right.
Right.
I have a friend who was the head of the journalism department at a university near me, and I asked him, he'd written stuff like this. He loved the kinds of chats that we would have, and he says, Jerry, I'd love to do it, but I don't have the time. Talk to this guy. And he was a teacher there. He's a journalism professor at Cal State University in Long Beach, who happened to have flipped out over the song You Were on My Mind when he was 10 years old.
Right. When
he first heard it. And so he met me, we talked, there was a compatibility of styles and interests, and he had the skill sets that I could have, gutted through, but to actually, the first time through, you get a book and get it right and have a structure so that it flows and that kind of thing. So we started working on it. He started interviewing me, and he went through the stuff that I had already written. Then we had to take a little time off because of some personal things that had come along that we needed to deal with. And so I recorded a CD called Jerry Burgan Reflections, Songs and Stories, and it was all songs that had meant something to me, and I wrote a little story about each one. I got done with that project, and then Alan was available again, and we went back to writing, and we had about 5 chapters, so we started, sending the submissions around. And we finally got a response from, at the time it was called Scarecrow Publishing, and now it's been absorbed into Rowman and Littlefield. And they've done a series of books on Arlo Guthrie, the Kingston Trio, a myriad of things like that, and my topic fit perfectly into what they had in mind. And it wasn't so much about dropping the names of a bunch of stars, and those are in there, but that isn't the point of the book. The point of the book is to look at what was going on in the world. Me as this naive kid from Pomona, California, who went from that to, being introduced by Fred Astaire, doing concerts in Pittsburgh with the Rolling Stones, and stuff of that nature. And we also happened to be the first integrated band I ever knew of, and we were touring America with a black drummer in '65 that did not go over very well. When we were in Atlanta, for example, and we were on a Dick Clark tour with Bo Diddley, Bo tried to take our drummer with him to keep him from staying in the hotel we went to, and we said, no, we're a band, we're going to go together. And so we encountered some of the ugly.
Yeah.
Some of the unexpected you don't get in California or New York or wherever. So the book is more about that, what was going on in music in America and in the lives of people that were my age. And I'm a couple of months too old to be a baby boomer. But the reality is there's 70 million people out there that went through pretty much the same thing I did, but not necessarily from within a successful recording group. And that's what we strive to do with the book, is to relate what I went through to what virtually everybody else went through in one way or another, but for them to be able to say, aha, that's cool. And from what I understand of anybody who's read it, they believe that we were successful in doing that. It reads kind of like a novel. It starts, kind of with me as a kid. You get into the recording studio pretty quickly, and then we go back and talk about how did that happen, rather than I did this and then I did that and then I did that. It's not one of those kinds of books. It reads pretty easily.
We're talking to Jerry Burgan of We Five, and his new book is called Wounds to Bind, which you can find on Amazon and at your local bookstore. And there's also a website for the book, woundstobind.com. And, of course, We Five have a website as well. Jerry, is there anything else?
And then my co-author, Alan Rifkin, has a Wounds to Bind Facebook page. And anybody who wants to right now can go to Facebook, wounds to bind, and then like it, get on board. And anytime a new change or a new announcement comes along, he'll be there.
That's great. I have one last question for you. I don't want to keep you too much longer.
No, we're fine. Go
Okay,
ahead.
one last question for you, because the song I want to end this interview with is Get Together, or Let's Get Together, if you want.
Right.
And that, of course, ties in with the Kingston Trio, the We Five, and then the song, with the Youngbloods becomes a hit.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about the story of that song? How did you guys get it, and then what did you think when it became a hit a few years later?
Sure, and it's a great question. You've got to start with the Kingston Trio.
Right.
They were a lot of people today don't realize they were the U2 of their day.
Oh, yeah.
They were the number one touring act in the world, and because they made their success recording folk songs, many of which were public domain, they had a publishing empire that was huge.
Right.
Because most of what they recorded, they had the publishing on. And a fellow named Dino Valenti came to San Francisco, and he was a songwriter, and he'd written this song called Let's Get Together. And the trio, ever looking for material, said, well, we'll record this song, but we're going to publish it. And so Dino did, and he actually had some legal meanderings that were going on at the time, and so he used a pseudonym called Chet Powers. And if you look on the We Five version, you'll see it was written by Chet Powers, but everybody knows Dino Valenti wrote it. It's one and the same person.
Right.
We're looking for material after the first hit, and we went through one of the songs we turned down was Along Comes Mary.
Well, you can't win them all.
In any event, we were also going through the catalog of stuff that the Kingston Trio had, and the trio had recorded that for an album, but they never put it out as a single.
Right.
And so we did. We recorded it in the summer, started on the summer of 65. We could never get it quite right, and we did 3 or 4 versions of it, and the one that was finally released in November of 65 made to number 31 on Billboard. But the problem is, as you know, because you've been in the business, you cannot put out a record before Christmas and expect to hear it again after January 1st. And so our version of Let's Get Together, had it been out 3 weeks early, probably would have been a top 10 hit. Instead, unless you really wanted it, you never even heard it, let alone got a chance to buy it.
Right.
And so it kind of went by the boards, and we did this and we did that. There was a group called the Jefferson Airplane that was, bubbling under in San Francisco at the same time we were breaking out. And they knew who we were, and they knew that we were doing that song. And, in fact, that song appears on the Jefferson Airplane Takes Off. Although it appears to have been released before ours because our second album got held up. It's the reason the group broke up, and that's in the book. But so the Airplane's version of Get Together on the album was on the market before most people knew we had done it. And yet that's where they got it. Now, we can also say that the Airplane and everybody else in San Francisco knew Dino Valenti, and he was always pushing, hey, do my tune, do my tune. And 3 years later, the Youngbloods did a version of his tune. And I would have to say they did to his tune the same thing that we did to Sylvia Tyson's You Were on My Mind. They reinvented it.
Right.
And another example of that happening would be Roberta Flack's version of The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face. That song had been around. It was I recorded it when I was in high school. Peter, Paul, and Mary did it. Everybody did it, but the definitive version was Roberta Flack. And so I think that when you listen to the lyrics for Get Together, and by the way, the Youngbloods dropped the word let's, although it was in the original title as written. They captured the mood of 1968 when it came out. And it was much mellower, it meandered, it flowed, it ebbed, rather than ours, which was kind of a straight-on, flogging the guitar type of thing.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot of reasons why theirs, it hit once on the West Coast and then it hit again nationally. So they actually had a hit with it twice.
Wow. Well, I mean, this sort of thing, it doesn't happen much these days because what's a hit? But, certainly,
you said it.
It's like, oh, a YouTube video is popular. Well, I guess that's a hit, But certainly, these songs would be around, and then just for some reason, a bunch of people would do them, but then someone would have the hit. The zeitgeist would be right.
Yep,
the stars
you're exactly
would align.
right, and that's what it is. And we benefited from that with You Were on My Mind, and I saw Sylvia Tyson 2 weeks ago, and she wrote the foreword for our book. And when we first put it out, because she was a folk singer, she wasn't crazy about what we did with it. And yet, you get the book and you read the foreword, and you will find a very loving, very appreciative Sylvia Tyson, recognizing that the song was bigger than her, bigger than us, bigger than anybody, and you don't take credit for that. You just accept the kudos that come along because you can't make it happen.
Yeah.
And she's very gracious, and we were delighted when she wrote the foreword.
Well, Jerry, I want to thank you so much. You've given us a lot to ponder here, and if the book is like this interview, we're in for a good read. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I hope that's the case, and please let me know if you'd like to carry on sometime. I'd be delighted.
Yeah, we'll have to have a part 2 of this at some point.
There you go.
Love is but the song we sing for fear the wind